what has happened in China in different way. But I cannot answer all the concerns very specifically because but generally I have to say that reform is never easy in China actually. There are many key obstacles. Vested interests, the inertia of ideology influence, complexities in rearranging institutions and interests. It's said to be a process with doubts and questions, with hesitations and new determinations. The process will take longer than people anticipated, and perhaps more bumpy too. But I still think that the complexity is even more confusing in the short term when people see policy arrangements can be in conflict or even contradictory to the original goal. But despite all the high cost of pushing forward reforms, the cost of no reform is even higher. That we believe that. We know it, we understand it. It's too high for China to afford, I would say. Reform is a path of no return. That's why China, with my faith, I believe China will go forward. China has to continue building its market economy. There is, in fact, no other choice. So I think the real task of China's growth in 2008 and beyond, against the U.S. trade war backdrop and beyond, is to what extent it can implement hardcore reform based on market principles, and whether it can remain an open economy. That's what we follow closely at Caixin. That's also what I devote my entire career to. So that's my faithful.
Well, just on that question specifically, some would argue that political developments of despite the rhetoric in China have led to a return to the state intervention, political control around state intervention that is shifting the tide against opening and reform. How would you respond to that?
It comes to a very specific area, and I said actually the real situation is very diversified, while different people view in a different way. So I just want to say that we face opening up and reform is not a question of should or should not, but a must. China must come in moving towards the market economy. I just mentioned that probably there are some short-term policy arrangements that can be confusing or probably disappointing for the real participants or observers that try to understand. But we can come to a very specific one, become very complicated. But however, I think eventually China has already decided and has already realized what it should do, and they're going to do it correctly, probably in a rather longer term, but not you don't have to wait for 10 years or after something. I think they're going to find the right way, not very short, not very, you don't have to wait for a very long time. I think there's a gap between China views itself, and the world view China. It takes time for them to realize that what the world is really viewing China. It's usually a couple of years, I think. But actually, I think China cares more about. I think people care more about their own problems, the real poverty, the gap between poor and the gap is so deep between poor and rich, and also the economic balance, and also environmental issues, a lot of issues. And they're very sure that the only way they can resolve the problem is going forward on market-oriented reform. It hasn't finished. They will go on. So it's hard for me to come to a very specific point to give the answer because it's a very diversified situation actually.
Malcolm, looking at some of the external dimension of the Chinese state initiative in the international economy, in particular on the infrastructure investment side with the Belt and Road Initiative, Australia's response to that has been, to put it mildly, cautious. I mean, we signed on to the AIB, which has been established and seems to be performing pretty well as a robust multilateral, multinational organisation. If anything, it's been sort of rather cautious and conservative in its approach to foreign investment, infrastructure investment. But the Belt and Road Initiative is another thing altogether on another scale, and we've been pretty cautious about that. And on this infrastructure investment side, does that confirm your view of how we're getting this wrong, or does it suggest that we should play it cautiously?
Peter, I think let's look at what the Belt and Road Initiative is. It's the signature policy of Xi Jinping for foreign investment, both into and out of China. As such, it has a whole range of mechanisms around it for streamlining approval systems within the Chinese system. If you're trying to seek a joint venture partner or to do business there, historically that's been quite difficult, quite frankly. Easier to sell stuff into China than to invest there. This makes it much easier, and people within the Chinese system know that it has the imprimatur of the highest levels, and so things occur. There's a lot of money associated with it and available. So, for example, the trade between BRI countries and China between 2014 and 2017 was about $3 trillion, expected to rise to 10 trillion going forward over the next decade. So it's a way in which Australian companies can invest into China or with China in the third world countries, or in Australia for Chinese companies to invest here. So it's a prize worth going hard to achieve. There was some difficulty around the wording, particularly regarding Northern Australia. I'm not across the details of that, but let's either change the wording or find the UK solution, which was, well, they didn't want to sign the actual agreement, but they appointed a special minister for state for Belt and Road, which has got the same outcome. And they do terrific business. So I just think it's in our interests to explore this further, and not just to fall into line behind the security rhetoric, which will have a different agenda. Trade is good. I think we would generally agree with that. Trade creates a peaceful world, and trade is certainly in our interests, given the size of our economy and the growing Chinese economy. And therefore, and it's not just construction, it's service industries, it's how you run things like road systems, toll roads. It's rolling out healthcare services. There's an awful lot beyond just construction of railways, bridges, and so on in the Belt and Road Initiative. And within Australia, there's different ways of doing it. If we don't like ownership of agricultural industries, then let's put together joint ventures and have a centre. For example, take Toowoomba with this new airport there. Let's have a customs centre at Toowoomba, which is run by the Chinese, bring stuff from the Darling Downs, put it there, gets customs clearance, and it's on the shores of Shanghai overnight. There's plenty of different ways of getting to the same outcome rather than binary yes-no answers. And I just think we need to be much more subtle and much more resolved to pursue this, because the prize is very large and it's ongoing.
At the centre of BRI is this infrastructure investment issue, really. And there's lots of money in that, ostensibly for infrastructure investment across Asia and around the world. And also potentially in Australia. But we've been pretty shy about this. And, as the discussion earlier suggests, there's a bit of an all-or-nothing approach to infrastructure investment from Chinese investors in Australia now, as if there's a security concern associated with any infrastructure investment, and there must be with all of them, really, of some kind. We don't know how to manage the trade-off. We don't know how to mediate the risk in it. So what would you do about this in terms of the management of this relationship between... as an economist, I find this discussion really quite strange because, we're always involved in economic dealings with mediating commercial or political risk of some kind. How should we manage this in relationship to the...
I thought there was a very good point made by one of the earlier speakers about, you don't have to have control. You can have, you look at the Japanese example, all of the Northwest Shelf, iron industry, coal industry.
It's all developed on that basis.
All developed as a result of finance out of Japan without majority control, and it worked well for both sides.
And consortia.
That's correct. And also in the you think about, if you want to look at governments with different views of the world, think about the Soviet Union, and we got into this, the West and the Soviets got into competing investments in places like Africa and so on. Basically outspent them. And you can't go to a sovereign country and say, don't take Chinese investment in new dams, which is, you don't like them. Of course we can take it. And we can either say, well, we'll give you better investment, or alternatively, we'll stand behind it so that if you can't make your repayments, we'll be a bank of last resort. There's plenty of other ways of doing it to get both the strategic outcomes and the economic outcomes. I just think that we need to put a lot more effort into the subtlety of it.
And so, Andrew, going forward, taking this issue, the other ways of doing it, if you had your way and you were looking at what the government might have done differently in terms of the dialogue with China on BRI and the rest of it, how would you have structured it? As a person involved in advising Australian business about how to manage these things, how would you have structured it? How could you have structured it differently?
Well, I agree with Martin's comments there on the BRI. I mean, the basic objection was it's a memorandum of understanding. It doesn't really mean very much. But my response is, well, that's exactly right. It's symbolic. Symbolism means a lot actually in diplomacy. And it's not like Australia doesn't sign MOUs with other countries, so why not in this case? And for those investments, BRI is it's a very broadly used term, but it's actually really difficult to define what exactly does it mean. And there'll be a range of investments that fall under BRI, some of which are really just straight aid, foreign aid type investments. They've got no hope of being commercial investment. And there'll be a range of things all the way through to things which are commercially investable, and we should be able to pick and choose which ones we want to invest in. I think on the flip side of this, and that's something that Australia could do. On the flip side of this as well, I think China, also needs to think a little bit more about how it conducts itself internationally as well. There's no doubt that when we're talking about foreign investment, for example, in this country, I think there are plenty of examples where the Chinese investors have not been as sensitive to the domestic political environment and how these foreign investment type decisions get made. And Heather referred to the one investment that Australian Super has been involved in. There's some good examples. The Melbourne Port example, where there's significant Chinese investment was made at exactly the time when all of the noise was happening around Ausgrid. It barely attracted attention. Why? Because it was a minority investment. So I think that China could actually do a little bit more homework in learning about our system and learning about the domestic realities that our politicians have to address as well, and be a little bit more informed about investing in this country and what it looks like.
Usually, what advice would you give to Chinese enterprise business in the conduct of especially its investment activities in a country like Australia, and also Chinese government? I know you're a private, you give advice to everybody, so you give a little advice to the Chinese government about how it should conduct the relationship with Australia.
I have to say, like in the past, in the past at least 20 years more, and we have discussed with or you see, advisor will say with Westerners to be patient about China, and they had always said yes, we were very patient, but now I have realized that the world seems not that patient about China now, and I share the same. I could share some of the same concerns and impatience as well, but I just think so. That's why I always insist on the faith and don't say belief. Because I think there's this commitment to China's commitment eventually to market economy is not a choice. It's a path of no return. Because reform is the single most important source that has resulted in China's economic miracle. Only by continuing it can China deliver future economic growth. And also, the market economy is not an abstract term, but an everyday reality. The market is already playing a big role in China. The depth of the capital market is there. The contribution by the private sector is already big. And entrepreneurs are forming a big community. The consumer society is already taking shape. They are there, and they are growing, which cannot be ignored or easily brushed aside, no matter what some probably minority think of us. I think it's impossible. Also, Chinese government has already made important decisions, repeated pledge to market reform. That is serious promise. Of course, we will have to watch whether and how that is implemented. But I think the direction is there, and also the speed. Probably sometimes faster, sometimes slower, but it also, they make mistakes and they correct it, or gradually they adjust it. But the whole society wouldn't wait for just the setback or going back. I think, so I still think that probably it's old advice, but it's still the same one advice is be patient.
I'm going to throw this last 10 minutes so open to questions from the floor in a minute, but before I do that, I'll just ask you one more question, Heather. The contemporary kind of institutional anchor for the relationship now is the chapter agreement. And as I said before, it's pretty significant because we're seen in China as a symbol of where China could go in other arrangements, including in the negotiation of the regional comprehensive economic partnership that's taking place in East Asia now, and in liberalisation, especially on the investment side, down the track towards the United States. But it's also significant because it's what's called a living agreement. So there's a lot of things that are unfinished and are up there to take forward in the arrangement. The investment chapter is incomplete in this respect. So we talk about the investment relationship with China going forward. Potentially it hinges on how we approach the extension and the extended negotiation of the investment chapter. So, looking forward, how do you think we can use this foundation in managing our economic relationships with China?
These agreements are really important. When you go back to the old CER we did with New Zealand about 25 years ago, if you look at that original document, and I hate to say I was part of it, it's just worlds different. So when you negotiate these agreements, you have to, and the ambition has to be that they keep evolving, and that you work on them and you review them, you find things you need to add to them, you find things you need to change in them. And getting the chapter up was a really huge achievement, and it was a lot of vested interest in Australia that had concerns about it, but Australia is essentially an open economy, the most open economy in the Western world. We are the only developed economy that has a trade surplus with China, so it made it an easier deal to achieve. So I'm very optimistic that we have that big hard head in the ground, and then we have to work on it. So I would like to see more working parties around the business, setting some strategic objectives that we can achieve and use it as a means of perhaps rebooting some of the relationship. But I know for a fact that a number of deals that were being put together on the back of it are being held up. Because business isn't silly in this country. It's there. It's trying hard. It's working things up. It's negotiating arrangements quite actively on the back of the services industry opening up, whether it's in healthcare, whether it's in aged care. So I do see it. I think it's a real issue for our government and the Chinese government to say, well, we've got this agreement. There's a real will on both sides to make it work and deliver. And it should be the lever upon which we go forward. And the strategic partnership, that's an area where we can talk about a lot of other things. But I would say one other thing. I think for too long, China was kept out of the big game in town, whether it's the IMF or the World Bank, and there was a lot of frustration. And the issue really always was going to be, if we did let them in and have their rightful say at the table as a big, powerful country, they were going to develop their own institutions and we would have to join them. So there's been a bit of that kind of pushback going on, I think, in the relationship. But I'd rather Australia look at its free trade agreement, its increase and expand into these other spaces. And there is no reason why Australia's doing it. It's 140 billion and 250 billion in a few years. More than half of it's got to find a home globally. There's going to be a lot of capital coming out of this country that needs to find a good home.
Yeah, it would seem to be particularly important for Australia to be active in this space in the same way as Mr. Abe is starting to be active in the China.
And we have an agreement.
Yeah. So let's take a couple of questions from the floor, if we could. Who'd like to start? Yeah.
Good. Yeah. David Sheridan from Prime Minister and Cabinet. I'm interested in the panel's views on the sort of interplay between strategic policy and economic policy, that it's often presented foreign investment as a choice between a security concern and an economic benefit. How does the panel feel about the interplay in terms of the argument that, say, a foreign buyer purchasing an Australian asset increases security by taking a bigger stake in Australia?
Malcolm, why don't you have your first shot at that?
It's a difficult question for me to answer because I'm not privy to sort of security issues. But look, if I can just answer it from the point of view of Orica, we invest in 54 different countries, Russia, through the Stands, China, down in Africa, and so on. And it is possible to have investment in assets which are not related to security concerns. And I always recall living in London, and you saw American investors buying real estate there, and the Japanese, and the Arabs, and the oligarchs, and now the Chinese. Funny enough, the bricks and mortar is still there. And I think we can get a bit carried away about who owns the infrastructure. If it's in Australia, it is a national asset. So I think that's for incoming investment and for external investment where you take on a case-by-case basis.
Heather, would you like to add to that?
I think it's interesting in business. My old organisation, for years there was a big debate about whether trade should be in with foreign affairs. That trade had its own role in life, and those foreign affairs people got in the way, let alone the spooks. That was the sort of issue. So, and I think that's been very much part of the China relationship. Probably we've let that mercantilist sort of view be a little bit too out of balance, and it needs to be brought back to balance. I think business understands in strategic assets about how that needs to be managed. But I don't see why, for example, in a lot of consortia, we can't work with a Chinese fund to work with Australian super in various areas as we've done in the past. And I think we can find a way through those things. We don't need to be divided in the community. We don't need to have these debates where people are get concerned and over-concerned. There's one thing I think we could just turn the Prime Minister's talking about getting a bit more chilled about the billboard. Well, I think we can get a bit more chilled about how we approach some of these issues, and that's a proud issue.
Who should have you got any observations on that?
It's okay.
Oh,
Later. Later.
yeah, well, I don't think there's any economic transaction in the world that doesn't involve the mediation of political and security risks. None. So let's get on with the business, I would say, as a matter of principle. Any other questions? Yes, sir. Jason.
Thanks, Peter. Just building on the political or the strategic and the economic and bringing it to the personal. And Peter, you and I have spoken on this topic. Something that is of particular concern, I think, going on now is because of the distrust that's in the community around China, broadly defined, that's making its way not only into economic decisions or strategic decisions, but it's making its way into distrust of Chinese Australians, people of either a PRC background or a non-PRC background. And so to some extent this is an organisational question for some of you who run organisations. How do we, I'm just trying to think of the best way to frame this, how do we not distrust Chinese Australians, for instance, with a PRC background, with sensitive information, even that's within our own organisations. For instance, Malcolm, in your organisation, say you had very sensitive commercial secrets to do with your trading relationships or whatever, and you had a senior staff member that was a PRC national but has now become an Australian citizen. How does one not prevent distrust such that that person is not invited to meetings, not given access to that confidential information? This applies to government departments, it applies to consulting firms, it applies to any context in which there is an Australian citizen who was once a Chinese citizen or has family or close relationships with the PRC. How do we stop this distrust eroding our very egalitarian society?
I'll leave that question sitting there, but I'll just add another one to it, and then we probably should wrap up because we're a bit over time. And that is the bigger question, a meta question. If there's something a bit broken, even if it's short term, but if it's structural in the relationship between Australia and China, this is for the Australians, not for who she'll ask her another question. What do our leaders, our political leaders, need to do to provide direction and reassurance in the relationship? So that sits on top of Jason's question. So who'd like to start first? Heather? Yeah.
In terms of your question...
Just press your little button.
I think companies, whether it's Australian Super, doing the Aussie deal, they're highly sensitive commercial arrangements that are tightly kept in the fund, in the investment section, etc. We have no discrimination. And what we do is apply the same rules to everyone. So managing data, managing the security of your information is every officer of the fund is subject to the rules. And if they're breached, we also have a much sharper focus on diversity, not just the gender, but in our investment team we've been internalising millions of dollars worth of investment. There's so many in the new team are of Asian descent, Chinese descent, generally. So we've embraced this issue. And I think we apply security. We do not go around thinking people who are PRC immigrants are distrustful. That is not the culture of Australian Super, and I hope it never is. In terms of the one thing that our leaders can do, that goes back to my earlier comment. I think we can shift the sort of way we approach things, the way we talk about things, from an assertiveness of Australia's interests and a scepticism, which is healthy, to away from being suspicious. And I think at the moment there's a kind of a suspicious feel about every time we look at investment from China or something, it's a bit suspicious. Are they trying to take over our agriculture? Are they trying to take over our assets? Are they trying to do this and that? I'd love to see a change in that kind of approach to the debate and the tone of it. And I think that'll do us a lot of good. I also think We don't have to be evangelists for liberal democracy in the world. That is not Australia's way. We don't impose our systems on other countries. We're good citizens. We believe in the fair go. We believe in this wonderful country. We don't have to go around lecturing people about liberal democracy to actually prosper and grow. They do need to have reform.